Hello and welcome back to Beyond the Veil background information. This time we're doing about the Veil culture and it's the vampire culture. In fact, this time we're talking about the Vampire Brotherhood. The Hemolacuna are such an unimaginative mishmash of words to sound threatening. Blood spiral. But no, Theodoric. Your dear Uncle Taliesin doesn't play around with the notorious Brotherhoods anymore, nor does he create them. They still come to me though. They like to think that exile means I'm just like them, but I'm a pedigree, and they're all mongrels trying to write their own pedigree. Oh, that face. Don't you enjoy the Kennel Club reference? Taliesin Gilmore II from the Black and Viper. Within the worlds of the vampires, there are a bunch of beings known as the Turned. Beings that are made vampires but have no vampiric blood at all, and instead choose or are made to be vampires. Amongst these have come 4 separate groups that are all identified through the reason they were made vampires by their vampire sires in the first place. 1. Charity. The better reason to be turned. These are humans who were dying or had saved the vampire and as a gift were drained of most of their blood and then fed vampire blood in order to turn. These are praised and often pulled into their sire's family as adopted members, although they hold no rank in the noble circles. 2. Gratitude. Often used for pets that have served a long, slow life, forsaking things like marriage and jobs to feed their vampire lords, and, instead of letting them die, they give them a second life in gratitude for what they have done. Once again, sort of encompassed into the family, but not recognised by the nobles. 3. Lust. Arguably the worst reason. This was initially what counts did, often by putting the female in dangerous situations that she would become their concubine. A married count was permitted to have as many turned concubines as possible to create spare heirs or even to prevent them playing with the wives of others or offering wives to their non-vampire allies. Since 1967 this was made completely illegal as a reason to turn a being, especially because this was used by traffickers to turn women under the legal age to keep their looks so that they could enter the sex trade in the Veil at the appropriate age but look young, a nasty trick that was a favourite of the Corsican Brotherhood. That's something that will be referenced in one of the Viper fan books. 4. Protection. When a vampire sees humans that are useful to them and they're in a bind, since the early days they have offered eternal life to a being willing to protect them forever and become part of their group. The majority of these were Crusaders and Saracens during the 13th century that were taken in, and thereby the origin of the term Brotherhood. Now, this gives you an idea of what the Brotherhood began as. It's the name for a group of turned vampires working either for themselves or for their sire and do not enter into the Vampire Council. Turned vampires did not have the same rights as normal vampires because they were not born that way and are often healthy for it. Turned females often get pulled 2 ways. They either get accepted into the family, although never addressed by their rank or permitted to mingle with non-turned females, or they end up in the sex trade. A safe trade if you're with the right kind of communities, but a lot of the trades are owned by demons or brotherhoods that aren't out for the turned but for themselves. For males, it's either being like a civil servant amongst the government body, many taking roles as managers and butlers and tax collectors, if not bodyguards, but if they are turned without such purpose, they are the most rejected by other vampires, and even non-vampires in the Veil don't give them much respect. The Brotherhoods were made up by these males mostly, with nowhere to go in the Veil, no respect, and stuffed into the areas where they had to share with demons and werewolves, almost at the very bottom of the rank. The same mafia mindset that developed the infamous mobs known outside of the Veil, i.e. the Cosa Nostra, Triad and Yakuza, began to form within the Brotherhoods of the Veil. They took on simple nicknames at first and worked as low-life criminals, using the usual racketeering, blackmail and bootlegging. When laws began to change, many found themselves able to hop in and out of the Veil with ease, giving them the chance to bring in innocents to hunt or traffic, as well as being distributed for the strict created drugs, which turned vampires seem to have curious immunity to. Just like any mafia, they were finding themselves wanted for what they could get no one else could without risk, and they were not afraid to be dirty. Things began to develop into more regional gangs, the Brotherhoods quite separated out, and as vampires were removed from their positions thanks to changes like the Iberian Revolution, the Crimson Dragon of Eastern Europe, and strange manners in the East, and the lack of real vampires in the Americas. By the 20th century, the Brotherhoods were starting to become the literal lords of the dark underworld, and on good terms with the demons and other night predators. This situation was improved by the actions of 3 of the noble circle that suited them greatly. First, Count Pipistrello passed away, and in a ruthless coup, his daughter, the Principessa, took power before her only brother Antonio could. She murdered all of his assistants and companions and exiled him to Sicily, where he was trapped by demons under her influence. It should have been enough to encourage him to commit suicide, as was expected, But Antonio decided to take things into his own hands. He was already aware of the Sicilian mafia developing outside the Veil, but within the Sicilian Veil there were no vampires but a lot of resources and a lot of tricks. He decided he would work with them to get drugs into the European Veil, but he needed to keep himself safe, and so, going against permission and being forced to age for the blood he took by ignoring it, Antonio turned 50 humans into vampires and created the Yīnyǐng, the blood spiral, using the Greek for blood to draw in the Strix and the Italian for spiral to denote its link there. It meant that anyone looking into the drugs would assume it was Strix connected and not to do with him. Antonio then used the Strix to get his agents into the European Veil, and also outside the Veil to get into the American regions to communicate with the Brotherhoods there. He was soon running a drug trafficking system despite being trapped in Sicily, and his agents, though only linked to him in rumour in the noble circle, were running riot around Europe. They are the biggest brotherhood or mafia in the European Veil, and made sure to do the one thing Antonio begged them to do: infiltrate the areas around the Swiss Vampire Academy with the Strix, and get as many noble males hooked on drugs as possible. His greatest achievement was causing the death of his grandnephew and sister's hopeful heir, Enrico, but when the Crimson Dragon awoke, just as he was having a great time in Europe, there was suddenly a rival. Unlike the Principessa, who unintentionally created the Yīnyǐng, the Eastern Bloc Brotherhood was created by Count Vlad Ubizia on purpose. On his escape into the Ural Mountains, abandoning his offspring to battle demons, a power they would not regain until the late 80s, Vlad was aided in his hiding by a young vampire whom he had given firm orders to go to Poland, where there were links into the normal Veil, and turn a collection of men he knew would be able to help him grow and communicate between him and the Veil. He wanted a brotherhood that would be able to mingle with the noble circle, not go against them. This vampire moved around Eastern Europe and could hardly find anyone useful until he came across a young, starving boy in Poland, turned him, and then raised him and those the boy made friends with to learn to navigate between the Veil. When this young male met Vlad on one rare trip, Vlad insisted him part of the family and named him the leader of the Brotherhood. This was how the Eastern Bloc formed, the young boys growing and learning to interact with the Veil and with Malvolio Viper to help rescue beings in need and gain favour. Though their sire was later captured by agents of the Crimson Dragon and assassinated, and they had to dodge the dangers of the Scandinavian hunters being created and invading the Red Veil to aid in the slaughter of vampires, they got through. Their leader, Nikolai Dziki, was able to guide the Brotherhood through, work good connections through various elements on both sides of the Veil, and even aid Vlad in getting his seat of power back, as well as surviving. They even took over the English Veil, running hotels for the vampire elite there, and taking over where the Vilmore lost out for nearly 100 years. Their efforts even brought them into communicating with the other Brotherhoods, making Nikolai one of the main representatives for the Brotherhoods and turned vampires to the noble circle, where they battle for acknowledgement. They're quite the opposite of the Yīnyǐng, but they still do underhanded things to get around. They just don't do drugs or people trafficking that would upset their big supporters Vlad and Malvolio. The third thing influenced by the Counts was something terrible. The Count of the Chinese vampires was murdered in a coup by the turned concubines in his harem, who were sadly incorporated into a dragon demon's deal with a human to turn a human male and put him in the place of power. These turned vampires were quick to take over almost completely throughout the Asian territories, and for a while were doing well until a rival vampire clan that had been ousted from inheriting the count position took back power. This clan, the Yīnyǐng, shadow in Chinese, so apologies for my pronunciation, I had to get Google to actually read that to me, pushed the turn out where they could, stealing their trade in blood, body parts, drugs and whatnot. The turned were kicked to Hong Kong, where they performed most of their human trafficking, but also their aggression towards the Shadow clan, making Hong Kong one of the most dangerous places in the Veil to be. This aggression has even stretched to vampires trading in the Veil, with various assassination attempts, including a hideously successful attempt. The Brotherhoods live by a very simple set of rules that are unanimous throughout, and though many now want acknowledgement and entrance into the noble meetings, and to have the same rights and respects as blue blood vampires, they still keep to the following. 1. Your loyalty is to your sire and your Brotherhood, not to the Veil agents or noble circle. 2. If someone wants something, do what you can to get it no matter what. 3. A favour owed is worth more than anything paid. 4. If you make your own family, keep them safe and have as many kids as you can. 5. Never accept anything offered by a noble. 6. Never mess with werewolves. 7. The Vampire King is always an ally. 8. When in shit, shut up. And 9. Never mess with Taliesin. These 9 simple things have been kept by all of them, though number 7 and number 9 have been more recent additions. There are many turned males out there that find themselves eager to create brotherhoods, left out of the loop and unwanted despite the fact they were made to be these beings. Unaligned males become the biggest problems for the Veil agents to deal with, and indeed the Veil itself. Rogue vampires are troublesome, and despite it all, the Brotherhoods have found themselves following the rule of permission in most cases, but always on the edge of trouble. The issues of the Brotherhoods being accepted as just part of the vampire community are now limited to criminal activity, of which many of the nobles are still involved in. But this is the basics you need to know about the Vampire Brotherhoods, basically the mafias of the Vale. And that's basically where the inspiration for them came from. Thank you for listening.